In this video, we're going to look at an HTML page that has an SVG element in it, and then JavaScript is going to create a design that's inspired by this work, Symphony in Blue by Victor Vasarely. So here is this image that we want to sort of make something that, sort of like and based on that, but I tend to make them sort of dynamic. So here is, let me start it off. I have these sort of shades of blue, but I have the color changing and I have these spheres sort of rotating. So just to give it a little bit additional sort of things going on to sort of challenge. Okay. So let's take that down. Okay. So how do we do this? HTML page, title, style, centered, has a style variable. So you see the colon root, you see the dash dash here, and then it's called half size. Somehow I made it 256. I've been making them 300 previously, but that's the whole thing. It scales with that size. Okay. And here I am styling the SVG and using var and calc methods to get the width and height to be 600 pixels. Okay. Title or header, and then SVG element, which is empty. Everything else is script. Okay, I have a constant num, and that is that there's sort of these sections, these whatever you want to call them, stripes, there are 10 of them. Okay, I have a constant which is W should be omega, sort of saying how fast these things are rotating, so you can get them to rotate faster. One way to get them to rotate faster is to change, increase this omega. Okay. I have a variable h for the hue, so I'm starting off with 230. So 230 started me in the sort of blue range because I was beginning with sort of trying to reproduce this one, which was blue. But I could have started anywhere. I have a time variable, and so I have something. I have some angle depending on my and rotating with this angular frequency, and so I have a time that's going to evolve, and I have the color. I'm going to get a color from the hue, and that's going to evolve, and I have color 1 and color 2, and color 2 is just a slightly darker version than I use for the stroke. So sort of all these shapes have like a thin stroke around them. I don't need that. I just looked it to my eye a little bit better with it. I am using set interval to set up a repeating timer. I'm calling a function Symphony every 33 milliseconds. And here I am getting my CSS variable half size and getting a JavaScript version of that M. And so M tells me sort of half the size, and then the radii of my circles are half of that. So M on 2 is going to be the radius of my circles. Here's my function. That's called by the timer. And I'm incrementing the time. I'm evolving the hue. The hue in this HSL Hue-Saturation-Lightness model is an angle in degrees. And so that's hence the modulus 360. So if I get above 360, take it back to 0. I'm clearing out anything that I might have had before, and then just sort of making it all over again. I put in something that was probably not in Vasarely's, but just I wanted to do it just to give me a little bit of added elements here. This background has a radial gradient, so you can see this background rectangle is a little bit brighter in the middle and darker on the edges. Okay, so here I am making a radial gradient. So I am creating an element that is a radial gradient. I'm giving an ID because then I'm down here. Where am I? The rectangle. When I finally make the rectangle, it's going to be filled with that gradient. And so I want my gradient to have an ID. Okay. So I have the radial gradient. I give it an ID. There are sort of two centers, the center for the outer color and the center for the inner color. So I just have, for me, it's pretty much the same color, but a different shade. But it could be different colors. So, but there are sort of two centers. There are two colors or two stops, and there's a center for like one stop in the center for the other stop, and I made them all like 50%, just stuck everything in the middle. Okay. But if you can sort of go on to like the W3 school site and look up radial gradient, and they give you a simple little thing, and you can sort of play with these things and see what they do. I just sort of took, for the most part, for these, the default values, and then I played with my colors, of course, but these I just sort of took as the default thing that they had set up on the W3 school example. So I made a gradient, and then a gradient has a stop, well, at least two stops. You can have other stops, but there's sort of a beginning stop and an ending stop. So here's the zero stop. This is for me the center, the brighter one, and so I'm saying it's the first stop, the 0% stop, and I'm using the hue, and here is my saturation 60 and my brightness of 60. And then here's my second stop, the 100% stop, same hue, same saturation, but a lower. So that is the darkness that you get here. Okay, and then I cleared out my SVG element. Then I am making a gradient, and then I'm making a stop, and then I add the stop to the gradient. So the stop is inside the gradient. So I have stop 1 and stop 2 are inside the gradient. Then I'm adding the gradient to my SVG. Okay. Then I'm making a rectangle starting at the upper left, going for the full width and the full height, so 2m. I'm filling it with the gradient that I made above, and I'm adding it to the SVG element. So that is the background with the gradient. Okay. Now I have a loop. Oops, sorry. Here I'm looping over 4 things. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay. And I am making a container. G is a container element. I'm giving the container an ID I. I'm going to add things to the container. So I want the container to have an ID so I can identify it and add things to it. And then I am adding the container to the SVG element. I'm defining color 1 and color 2. And this is for, I'm going to start off by making a circle, and that circle is going to be fairly light. So I start off with a fairly light, almost white circle. And so I'm making a circle. I'm going to put everything as if it's centered at 0, 0. And then I'm going to move and rotate my containers. So I'm going to make all my things, add them to my container, have them centered at 0, 0, and then move my containers. So there is the center of the circle horizontally and vertically is 0. The radius is half of m. So m is half of the size of the SVG. And then I want half of that for the radius. I'm filling it with color 1. Color 2 is the stroke. So there will be sort of a little stroke border around it. And then I am adding that circle to the sort of jth container. Now I have a loop starting with 1 to num. I don't start at 0 because in some sense the circle was the 0 at 1. So I'm going to make an arc, and it was sort of difficult to make. And so when I make an arc, I have sort of starting point and then some definition of how I want the arc to be, and then this closing point of the arc. And it was sort of too hard to make, when the points were sort of the same. It was sort of too hard to make the arc. Um, so that's why I made just the full circle above. And so I'm starting at 1. I'm defining the color again with the hue, bumped up the saturation compared to the background, and I am varying with I the lightness. So that is this, light to dark. Okay. So when I is low, I am close, high. My lightness is high, and I'm very bright, close to white, and then I go darker. I am figuring out the X and the Y of a point on my arc. And the X just sort of moves across. So I was making this, imagine the x-axis went like this way. And so as I move along the X moves sort of a uniform amount. So the X is just linear in I, and then adjusted because the center of the circle was at 0. So I need to sort of start at minus m divided by 2 and then divide and then move over linear. And then when I get to sort of, I got all the way to num, then it would be, I would be on the other side of the circle. Okay. The y I'm finding by the equation of a circle. So this is sort of this m times m divided by 4. That's sort of the radius square. So if I take, the equation for a circle is x squared plus y squared equal x squared plus y squared equals r squared. I'm solving for y. So y is the square root of r squared minus x squared. The radius is m on 2. So m times m divided by 4, that's the radius squared minus the x squared, take the square root. And that gives me the y corresponding to that x. So the first thing when I'm making a path is the starting point, and I use an m. So I have an m with that x and that y. Then I am specifying next with this letter A that there are different kinds of paths, like Bezier quadratic, Bezier cubic. This is going to be an arc path. So the A tells me it's an arc path. And arcs are ellipses. It's an elliptical arc. And so there are 2 radii. For me, they're circular. So the 2 radii are both half of the same. So that is the part of the arc where I say it's it's an arc, and the two radii are the same, and they are half of it. Now, when you're making an arc, there are these three parameters, and I have a change depending on, are you making the arc and the last thing, so I have to jump to the last thing and then come back. The last thing is the ending point, and it's the same x and negative y. So I'm going around a circle, and I'm going from here, the sort of positive, the x with the positive y, and then going x to the minus y. And I want to know, when I'm making the arc, do I want to do the closer one or the farther one? Do I want to be sort of more than half the circle or less than half the circle when I'm making the arc? And that's what this is controlling. So when I'm on one side of the hemisphere, I want the one. On the other side, I want the zero. Okay, so is my arc the whole arc that I'm making? And these arcs are sort of all overlapping and getting smaller. So that's the order matters here. That as I'm making more of these slices, I'm not really making the slices. I'm making this great big arc and then just putting them on top of one. Okay, and it changes somewhere along the way at the halfway point of whether I want this to be a 1 or a 0. And then I add my closing point of my arc. I make the path. All this was the D attribute of the path, so I add that. I added a fill, I added my stroke, and then I add it to my container. And then finally, almost done, I am going to transform. I'm going to move my containers. So I give my container G a transform property, and I'm going to give it a translate and a rotate. So this is fairly long and ugly here. But this, I'm translating it M, which is to the middle. And then I'm doing this sort of cosine and sine thing. And that is just getting me I'm moving to the center, and then I'm going to the various quadrants at sort of 45-degree angles in all the quadrants. So there, this Math.PI times the quarter, that's like the 45 degree in radians. And then I have all the various j on 2 times pi. So that for the different j is getting me around to the quadrants. This is getting me the 45 degree within that quadrant. And I got the cosine and the sine, so the horizontal and the vertical. So that positions my containers in the quadrants around the point MM in the middle. And then the rotation, I had sort of an initial rotation of 90. That's just so that I wanted to start with sort of this. So if I refresh, I have the dark at the top. So that was the 90. That gave me that initial matching what I found in what I found with Vasarely and what I wanted to mimic. The 90 times j is moving me from quadrant to quadrant and changing them by 90 degrees. So they are all rotated 90 degrees as I go around the circle from each other. And then here's the omega t. So that is the rotation in time. As you can see, if you wait a little bit long enough, you can see it's rotating in time. And there I am at the bottom of this thing. So that's what we made. We had another Victor Vasarely design that was sort of a fun challenge to make, and added some features like changing color and making it rotate. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for your attention.